One coin, two sides. That's the dual nature of the media when it comes to miscarriages of justice. On one hand, it's a powerful ally, shining a light on some of the most shocking injustices in British history. Yet, there's a darker side that can stir public outrage and shape narratives that lead to further injustice. Today, we dive deep into this paradox. How can the media be both a guardian of justice and a participant in injustice? Join the conversation and let's flip this coin together.
Welcome to Spoken Injustice, where we put the criminal justice system in the dock. There is little doubt that anyone who believes power resides solely within the traditional three branches of the state, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, holds an incomplete view of the modern democracy's function. While these institutions remain the former pillars, they do not exercise power in isolation. Alongside them operate other centers of influence that, although lacking constitutional status, can profoundly shape public policy, political priorities, and even, I dare say, the administration of justice. Powerful commercial organizations, for example, can exert significant influence through their economic weight, lobbying, and control of resources. Equally influential is the media, often described as the fourth estate. The media possesses a unique ability to shape public opinion, frame political and legal debates, determine which stories receive attention, and influence the direction of public discourse itself. In the 21st century, however, a further layer of influence has emerged. Social media platforms have transformed the way information is produced, disseminated, and consumed. They have democratized public discourse by giving individuals an unprecedented ability to publish and share information, but they have also accelerated the spread of narratives, speculation, and misinformation. Social media often operates without editorial oversight, allowing public opinion to crystallize within hours, long before facts have been fully established. In the context of criminal justice, this creates a new and formidable source of influence, one capable not only of amplifying the work of professional journalism, but also of bypassing it altogether. Neither the traditional media nor social media exercise legal authority. They cannot pass laws, imprison individuals, or overturn convictions. Yet their power lies elsewhere, in their capacity to influence what people believe, what questions are asked, and which institutions are held to account. In democratic societies, that influence can be both indispensable and immensely powerful. It is precisely because of this extraordinary influence that the media occupies such a paradoxical position in the context of miscarriages of justice. At its best, it has exposed institutional failures, uncovered wrongful convictions, and given a voice to those who might otherwise have been forgotten. At its worst, it has contributed to public certainty before the evidence has been fully examined, reinforcing narratives that may later prove to be incomplete or even mistaken. The relationship between the media and miscarriages of justice is far more complicated than we often acknowledge. On one hand, investigative journalism has exposed some of the greatest failures in British legal history. Reporters have uncovered hidden evidence, challenged official narratives, and kept forgotten cases alive until justice was finally done. Without journalists, there are people who may still be in prison today or whose names might never have been cleared. Yet there is another side to this story. The media can also become part of the machinery that produces injustice. Public opinion can harden before all the evidence has been tested. Headlines can create certainty where uncertainty should remain. Once narrative takes hold, questioning it can become incredibly difficult. Understanding miscarriages of justice therefore requires us to recognize that power does not reside solely in the institutions created by the Constitution. It also resides in those institutions capable of shaping public perception. And today, that power is exercised not only by newspapers and broadcasters, but also by the digital platforms that have become the new public square. Understanding miscarriages of justice requires us to examine not only what happens inside our courts, but also the stories we tell outside them. So today's question is the media one of justice's greatest allies or one of its greatest threats? In this video, we will explore these two seemingly contradictory roles. First, how journalism became one of the most important safeguards against wrongful convictions. Then, why that role appears to have diminished in recent decades. And finally, how the media itself can become part of the very problem it is supposed to expose. So stay with us until the end to form your own opinion. And if you have not done so already, hit the subscribe button below to help us with our mission to humanize the criminal justice system. So let's start with exploring how investigative journalism became one of the most important safeguards against wrongful convictions and why its role proved indispensable in exposing some of the gravest failures of the criminal justice system. To understand why the media occupied such a unique position in the criminal justice system, we first need to look back. Long before there was an independent body dedicated to reviewing miscarriages of justice, it was often journalists who uncovered hidden evidence, challenged official accounts, and refused to let doubtful convictions disappear into history. Every safeguard in the criminal justice system exists for one reason: because no institution is infallible. Police officers make mistakes, prosecutors make mistakes, judges and juries make mistakes. And when those mistakes lead to the conviction of an innocent person, someone must be prepared to ask uncomfortable questions. For much of the 20th century, that role often fell not to the courts, but to investigative journalists. Before 1907, if someone was wrongly convicted, there was no general right of appeal against conviction in England and Wales. A convicted person could only hope that the Home Secretary would intervene through the royal prerogative of mercy, which was a political rather than a judicial remedy. Public concern following several controversial convictions led to the creation of the Criminal Appeal Act 1907, which established the Court of Criminal Appeal. Although the creation of the Court of Criminal Appeal marked a significant step forward in recognizing that miscarriages of justice could occur, the appeal process was never intended to be an endless opportunity to relitigate a case. Appeals were primarily concerned with correcting errors that had occurred during the trial, while the legal system also placed great importance on the principle of finality. At some point, litigation had to come to an end. However, over time, it became clear that exceptional cases required an exceptional remedy. Sometimes new evidence emerged years after the trial had concluded, evidence that had not been available to the jury or the appeal court. The courts gradually recognized that in such circumstances, justice demanded a mechanism for reopening a case. This did not mean that every prisoner maintaining their innocence was entitled to another appeal. The new evidence had to be genuinely fresh, credible, and capable of casting doubt on the safety of the conviction. But this raised an obvious question. Who was going to find that fresh evidence? The courts did not investigate cases, and once the ordinary appeals had been exhausted, there was no independent body responsible for looking for new evidence. Increasingly, that role was assumed by investigative journalists. They did not overturn convictions, of course, that remained the responsibility of the courts, but they uncovered the evidence, exposed the investigative failures, and asked the difficult questions that made fresh appeals possible. It was in this way that investigative journalists became one of the most important safeguards against wrongful convictions in the United Kingdom. The emergence of television gave this movement an even greater public profile. Rather than simply reporting on criminal cases, journalists began to reinvestigate them. Programs such as Rough Justice and Trial and Error invited viewers to look again at convictions that had long been considered settled. Through meticulous investigation, interviews with witnesses, and forensic examination, these programs helped uncover evidence that ultimately led to wrongful convictions being overturned. Rough justice alone played a role in overturning the convictions of 18 people across 13 separate cases. And more broadly, it demonstrated the vital role that investigative journalism could play in exposing miscarriages of justice and help build the momentum that eventually led in 1997 to the establishment of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC, an independent body created to investigate potential miscarriages of justice and, where appropriate, refer cases back to the Court of Appeal. I had the privilege of discussing this remarkable period in British investigative journalism with Stephen Phelps, the producer of Rough Justice and Trial and Error, in one of our episodes of In Conversation with the podcast. His insights provide a fascinating account of how journalism became one of the most effective safeguards against wrongful conviction before the creation of the CCRC. The creation of the CCRC in 1997 was widely welcomed as a landmark reform. For the first time, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland had an independent body whose sole purpose was to investigate potential miscarriages of justice and, where appropriate, refer back to the Court of Appeal. To many, it appeared that a long-standing problem had finally been solved. No longer would prisoners maintaining their innocence have to rely on the determination of a journalist, a campaigning lawyer, or a concerned family member to persuade the authority to look again at their case. There was now an institution specifically created to perform that function. Perhaps inevitably this changed the landscape. As responsibility for investigating potential miscarriages of justice became institutionalized, investigative journalism gradually ceased to occupy the central role it had played during the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Television programs devoted to reinvestigating convictions disappeared. Newspapers invested less in long-form criminal justice investigations, and many assumed that the difficult work of uncovering wrongful convictions had passed from journalists to the CCRC. Whether that assumption proved justified is another question entirely, as criticism of the CCRC has grown in recent years. Many have begun to ask whether investigative journalism stepped back too soon. If the body entrusted with investigating miscarriages of justice is itself accused of failing to fulfill that role effectively, then perhaps independent journalism is needed now as much as it ever was. So now we come to what I believe is the most intriguing and perhaps the most important part of this discussion. We have seen how investigative journalism became one of the most effective safeguards against wrongful convictions. We have explored how determined reporters uncovered fresh evidence, challenged official narratives, and in many cases played a crucial role in exposing miscarriages of justice that the legal system had failed to correct. But if journalism has the power to uncover injustice, can it also have the power to create it? At first glance, the question seems almost contradictory. How can the very institution that has helped free innocent people also become part of the machinery that leads to injustice? To better understand this, it is useful to examine its historical development. First, it is important to note that up to this point, I have deliberately spoken about journalism, investigative reporting at its best. But from here on, I want to broaden the discussion to the media more generally, because newspapers, broadcasters, and now digital platforms and social medias all play a part in shaping public perception. And together, they have the power not only to expose miscarriages of justice, but to contribute to them. The answer lies in recognizing that the media is neither inherently good nor inherently bad. Like every institution that wields significant influence, its power depends on how that influence is exercised. The same ability to shape public opinion, direct attention, and hold institutions to account can, under different circumstances, contribute to premature conclusions, reinforce dominant narratives, and make it increasingly difficult for alternative perspectives to be heard. In other words, the very qualities that make media such a powerful force for justice can also, if they are not exercised with care, make it a powerful force in the making or perpetuation of a miscarriage of justice. And that is the other side of the coin. If the first half of this video has shown journalism at its very best, the second half asks a far more uncomfortable question. How can the same institution that has helped expose miscarriages of justice also become part of the process that creates them? The answer lies in the extraordinary power of the media to shape public perception, whether through newspapers, television, or today's social media. The media does far more than report events. It frames them. It determines which voices are heard, which questions are asked, and perhaps most importantly, which narratives become accepted as truth. That power can be a force for accountability, but it can also become a force for certainty, sometimes long before all the evidence has been examined. History offers us some striking examples. When the Birmingham Six were arrested in 1974, much of the press portrayed them as the perpetrators of one of the worst terrorist atrocity ever committed on British soil. The atmosphere was one of outrage and certainty. Their guilt was presented not merely as the prosecution's case, but as an accepted fact. In a letter written in 1987 from Gartree Prison, Paddy Hill, one of the Birmingham Six, stated, "To hand over Irishmen or women to a British court is to condemn them to a system where they will not receive a fair or impartial trial, where they will be judged and sentenced by the British media before they even set foot inside a court." Years later, when their convictions were finally quashed, the media played a very different role. Investigative journalists helped expose inconsistencies in the evidence, challenged the official narrative, and contributed to the campaign that ultimately secured their release. It was then that Paddy Hill so memorably observed, "We were put into prison just to satisfy and to quell the public outcry, and in the end, it was the public outcry that got us back out again." Few quotations better capture the paradox at the heart of our discussion today. It's an extraordinary statement because it reminds us that public opinion can be both a distractive and a corrective force. Yet public opinion rarely forms on its own. It is influenced by what people read, what they watch, and today, what they consume online. In other words, it is influenced by the media. The same media that helped create the atmosphere of certainty surrounding the Birmingham Six later played a vital role in dismantling that certainty by exposing the flaws in the prosecution's case. The same pattern can be seen in other cases. Sally Clark was subjected to intense media scrutiny following the deaths of her two infant sons. Like the Birmingham Six before her, public opinion hardened rapidly, and the portrayal of her case in much of the media reflected the assumption that justice had been done. Only later, as flaws in the medical and statistical evidence and failure of disclosure came to light, did the narrative begin to change. This phenomenon is perhaps best captured in Stolen Innocence, the book recounting Sally Clark's ordeal. Referring to the prosecution's opening note, the author, John Butt, observes, "This is the most newsworthy part of the trial. It will probably be quoted verbatim in every paper and on every newscast. And allegations make headlines, defenses don't." That simple sentence exposes one of the inherent difficulties in reporting criminal trials. The prosecution opens the case by presenting a coherent and often compelling narrative of guilt. It is dramatic, newsworthy, and immediately reported across newspapers, television, and today, of course, social media. The defense, by contrast, may not begin presenting its case until days or even weeks later. By then, the headlines have already been written, and public opinion may already have begun to crystallize. Of course, jurors are repeatedly instructed by the trial judge to decide the case solely on the evidence presented in court and to avoid the media coverage. That direction is fundamental to the fairness of a criminal trial. But we should also ask ourselves a practical question. How realistic is it to expect jurors, or indeed the wider public, to avoid all exposure to a case that dominates newspaper, front pages, television broadcasts, and increasingly social media feeds? Even the most conscientious juror cannot avoid passing newspaper headlines at a newsagent, hearing a radio broadcast in the background, or seeing online stories shared by friends and family. And what those early reports almost invariably contain is the prosecution's account of events. The defense has not yet been heard. This creates an inherent imbalance. The allegations are reported at their most dramatic moment, while the explanation, the challenge, and the defense often receive far less attention. This illustrates how easily public perception can become to form before all the evidence has been heard. In cases that later proved to be miscarriages of justice, that imbalance can have profound and lasting consequences. A similar pattern can be seen in the post office scandal. For years, many sub-post masters and sub-post mistresses were portrayed in local newspapers as dishonest employees who had stolen from their communities. Their prosecutions and convictions were reported as if they were simply another example of trusted individuals betraying the public's confidence. Their side of the story was rarely heard, and many experienced not only criminal convictions, but also public humiliation, financial ruin, and social isolation. Years later, as the scale of the scandal began to emerge, the narrative was transformed. Those once branded as thieves came to be recognized as victims of one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in British legal history. What is particularly striking for the post office scandal is the role the media played in that transformation. Although investigative journalists had spent years uncovering the flaws in the prosecution, it was surprisingly the television drama Mr. Bates versus the Post Office that brought the scandal into millions of homes. In an age determined by digital media and social media platforms, it was traditional television that succeeded in generating an unprecedented level of public engagement and political pressure. The impact was remarkable. Public outrage intensified almost overnight. The issue dominated national debate. Honours were relinquished, political leaders promised urgent action, and Parliament moved swiftly to introduce legislation designed to exonerate many of those who had been wrongfully convicted. Whether one applauds or questions legislation enacted in response to public pressure is a separate debate for another video. What cannot seriously be disputed here is the extraordinary influence of the media. Once again, it demonstrated its ability not merely to report events, but to transform public perception, shape political priorities, and accelerate legal reform. The post office scandal therefore illustrates perhaps better than any modern example the immense power of the media. It has the capacity to destroy reputation when the prevailing narrative is wrong, but it also possesses the unique ability to restore those reputations when the truth finally emerges. Today, the landscape has changed once again. Newspapers and television no longer shape public opinion alone. They are joined by online news outlets, podcasts, blogs, and above all, social media. Information now travels faster than ever before. Narratives are formed within hours, shared millions of times, and reinforced by algorithms. The case of Lucy Letby illustrates this modern media environment. Whatever conclusion one reaches about the case itself, it demonstrates how contemporary media ecosystem can generate intense public narratives that extend far beyond the courtroom. Traditional journalism and social media all interact, creating an environment in which questioning prevailing assumptions can become increasingly difficult. Thus, the same machinery capable of uncovering injustice is also capable of contributing to it. The difference lies not in the power itself, but in how that power is exercised. What we are seeing here is the asymmetry of publicity at work. The allegations were front page news. The defense and later the doubts struggled to command the same attention. The Lucy Letby case illustrates something else that deserves careful reflection as well. In modern criminal investigations, communication is no longer confined to the courtroom. Police forces now have sophisticated media departments, carefully managed press strategies, and direct relationship with broadcasters and documentary makers. They are no longer simply investigating crime. They are also communicating their investigation to the public. There is, of course, nothing inherently improper about informing the public. Transparency is an important feature of modern policing, but there is an inevitable consequence. The official account enjoys an authority that no competing narrative can easily match. When the police speak, they do so with the credibility of the state behind them. Their interpretation of events is repeated by national newspapers, broadcasts or television, incorporated into documentaries, and amplified across social media. By the time a case has concluded, that narrative may already have become deeply embedded in the public consciousness. The difficulty arises when respected scientists, clinicians, Statisticians or legal commentators later raise legitimate questions about aspects of that evidence. Whatever the merits of those questions, they are no longer competing on equal terms. They are challenging a narrative that has already been endorsed by official institutions, repeated by major media organizations, and reinforced through millions of online interactions. This is one of the defining characteristics of the modern media landscape. It is not simply that official voices are heard first, it is that they are heard louder, more often, and with an authority that alternative voices struggle to match. Documentary makers, news organizations, and social media users may sincerely believe they are simply reporting established facts, yet together they contribute to the creation of a dominant public narrative that increasingly becomes resistant to challenge. Whether that narrative ultimately proves correct or incorrect is not the point. The point is that once public certainty has been established through the combined authority of state institution and mass media, those seeking to question it face an extraordinary, uneven playing field. In other words, the so-called fourth estate cannot fulfill its role if it merely amplifies the first estate. The role of journalism is not to repeat the official narrative, but to scrutinize it. So, where does this leave us? Throughout this video, I've argued that the media has two faces. It has been instrumental in uncovering some of the greatest miscarriages of justice in British history. Without courageous investigative journalists, many innocent people might never have had their convictions overturned. Yet, we have also seen how the media can contribute to miscarriages of justice through sensational reporting, trial by media, one-sided narratives, or the relentless amplification of official accounts. It can create an environment in which certainty takes hold long before all the evidence has been properly tested. These two realities are not contradictory. They are two sides of the same coin. The lesson, therefore, is that we should expect the media to fulfill the role for which it has long been regarded as the fourth estate. The media exists not to exercise state power, but to scrutinize it. Its loyalty should never lie with governments, police forces, prosecutors, or courts. Equally, it should not become an unquestioning advocate for those who claim to have suffered injustice. Its loyalty must lie elsewhere. It must lie with the evidence, with the intellectual honesty, and above all, with the relentless pursuit of the truth. History teaches us that no institution is infallible. The media is not different, but the media has something unique. It has the freedom to ask difficult questions without fear or favor. It can investigate where others cannot. It can expose what others overlook. It can give a voice to those who would otherwise remain unheard. As new technologies transform the way information is produced and consumed, and as social media increasingly shapes public opinion, the need for independent, fearless, and impartial media has never been greater. Perhaps it is time to rediscover the spirit of programs such as Rough Justice and Trial and Error, because justice itself depends upon the willingness to question even our most deeply held assumptions. That, I believe, is the media at its very best. Not a cheerleader for the state, not an opponent of the state, but its most important independent scrutinizer. In a democracy, justice depends not only on the independence of our courts, but also on the independence of those who hold every institution, including the courts themselves, to account. The media will always have two sides. Our task is not to choose between them, but to ensure that the side devoted to truth, scrutiny, and accountability always outweighs the side driven by sensationalisms and uncritical repetition. Only then can it truly fulfill its role as the fourth estate. I hope this video has given you a fresh perspective on the complex relationship between the media and miscarriages of justice. My purpose has not been to criticize the media as an institution, not to idolize it, but to encourage a broader discussion about the vital role that independent journalism plays in a democratic society, and in particular in safeguarding the integrity of our criminal justice system. This is a conversation that is far from over, and I certainly do not claim to have all the answers. If you are a journalist, academic, lawyer, former investigator, media professional, or simply someone who has studied this issue in greater depth, I would warmly invite you to join the discussion. If you can challenge these ideas, improve upon them, or offer practical solutions for strengthening the independence and scrutiny of our justice system, our community would love to hear from you. Our community exists precisely to encourage thoughtful, respectful, and evidence-based debate. As always, thank you for watching and for being part of this growing community. If you found this discussion helpful, consider liking and sharing this video and subscribe to the channel to help us with our mission to humanize the criminal justice system. Join us again as we sit and rise in this unique trial.